I understand we have one Sunday school class that's beginning on the Shack, which is a wonderful book, and I had some resources to share, and y'all are more than welcome to those. And please see the ladies, and they'll get those to you. And it's a wonderful book. It's a wonderful movie, and the movie is extremely close to the book. It is probably one of the closest things that I've ever seen when it comes to taking a book and putting it into a movie. So it was fantastic. Our scripture this morning picks up where we left off last week. And who remembers what we talked about last week? Yes, and feeding the 5,000, right? That's a lot of hungry people, isn't it? What was Jesus trying to do right before that? Yes, he was wanting to get away. He needed a break. And then this crowd shows up, and he has to sit down and feed them and take care of them and heal them and all of this stuff. And so now we're at Matthew 14, verses 22 through 23, and this picks up where we left off last week. Right then, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead to the other side of the lake, while he dismissed the crowds. When he sent them away, he went up to the mountains by himself to pray. Evening came, and he was alone. Meanwhile, the boat, fighting a strong headwind, was being battered by the waves and was already far away from land. Very early in the morning, he came to his disciples walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified, and they said, "It's a ghost." They were so frightened they screamed. Just then, Jesus spoke to them. "Be encouraged. It's me. Don't be afraid." Peter replied, "Lord, if it's you, order me to come to you on the water." And Jesus said, "Come." Then Peter got out of the boat and was walking on the water towards Jesus. But then Peter saw the strong wind. He became frightened, and he began to sink, and he shouted, "Lord, rescue me." Jesus immediately reached out and grabbed him, saying, "You man of weak faith, why did you begin to have doubts?" When they got into the boat, the wind settled down. Then those in the boat worshiped Jesus and said, "You must be God's Son." This is the word of God for us, the people of God. Thanks be to God. There's been a lot of screaming at my house this week, and that's just not normal. Lee and I decided to watch scary movies this week when we had a break. There's been a whole lot of noise at my house. Can you imagine being in a boat, knowing that there's nobody around you, and all of a sudden here comes a guy walking up? That would be scary, wouldn't it? Well, I want to tell you a story. The other day, Jack and Gary took me fishing. And we go out on the boat, and we get out in the middle of the lake, and Jack says, "I forgot the bait." And Gary says, "Well, I guess we're going to have to row back to shore to get it." And I said, "No, I get it." So I get out of the boat, and I walk over, and I pick it up, and I start back, and Jack says, "Look at that. Just like the Methodist church send us a woman that can't swim." We don't see people walk on the water, do we? And if y'all see me in the water, it will be walking on the water, because Jesus will have to make me walk, because I'm not getting in. But when we think about water, and back in those days, water had this high of being something scary, something mysterious, because they didn't know what the water was. And the water, they thought, had demons in it. So being in the water was a scary thing. And it wasn't until later we learned that those were whales, and those were dolphins, and those were manatees and things like that, that we're not so scared about, the animals that we see now that we're not afraid of because we're used to seeing them. But back then, when they saw a sea creature, it was something to fear. And here these guys are out in the middle of the water, and this storm is upon them. Now, I don't know about y'all, but when my kids were little, I loved to take them to the edge of storms. And when we were in Florida, we would stop on the side of the road and watch the storms come in. And that was a fun thing to do because you could see the lightning way out in the distance, and the lightning would be striking out in the water, and then it would keep coming closer and closer and closer and closer until we decided it was time to go home. But it was a beautiful thing because it's God's creation. I remember as a little girl, my mom always told us if there was a tornado, and we had a lot in Cowpens for some reason, and she would always tell us if there's a tornado, you go get under your brother's bed, because that was pretty much the center of the house and the safest place to be. And so one time when I was 7 years old, my mom wasn't there to yell at me to make me get under the bed. And so I'm sitting there and I'm watching out the window and I'm so excited because here comes this tornado and it's sucking stuff up and I'm like, man, this is cool. And I'm sitting there watching it, and as it gets closer and closer, we had this huge willow tree and the willow tree goes whoop. And I'm like, man, that's really neat. And I get thrown under the bed. So my mom caught me by that time. But storms are something that are amazing to us, aren't they? There's something that can be very frightening, but there's something so powerful about them. And have you ever thought about when it's raining and the sky's all gray? Have you ever looked at flowers? They're so much brighter because all you've got is this background of gray, and then you've got this pop of color. And I think that's God saying, hello. And it just makes me happy to see those things. But for some people, storms are very bad things to happen. I knew this wonderful little man, and his name was George. And I went on a mission trip one time, and I didn't know how George got attached to us. I couldn't figure it quite out. Because when we were down there, George just shows up. Well, George didn't come down on the bus. And George didn't sleep with us at night when we were at the church doing our devotions and stuff. George was never there. So I couldn't quite figure out where George came from. George just popped up. And so we talked to him throughout, but everybody loved George. Everybody accepted George. And it seemed like a lot of the people knew George. I didn't, but everybody else seemed to. So one night we go to dinner, and George went with us. And he's sitting there. I said, George, how did you get hooked up with these crazy Methodist people? Because it was an UMCOR thing where UMCOR had gone down, was trying to help the East Coast get resettled. And he said, you know, that's a funny story. He said, my wife had been sick for years. He said, and she was the love of my life. I love this woman more than I could ever tell you. And she got sick. And you know the houses down east are built up high. And he said, as she got sick and couldn't walk, he said, I would pick her up and walk up the steps with her. And he said, if we had to go somewhere, I'd pick her up and I'd bring her down the steps. He said, there's nothing in the world that I wouldn't do for my wife. She was so precious, and I just loved her so much. He said, and then she died. He said, for me, I thought my life was over. He said, I thought the storm can't get any worse than this because this has been the love of my life. I've never known anybody else, and she's gone. He said, within a week, there came this horrible storm. He said, and a tree fell right in between my house, right in the middle. He said, so my house that I've got to live in is gone. My wife is gone, and I feel like I have nothing. But you know, we always have insurance, right? So I call the insurance company and I say, look, a tree fell through my house and I need some help. And the insurance agent said, you don't have insurance. You didn't pay your premium. He said, in the midst of trying to take care of my wife and losing my wife, I failed to pay my insurance premium. He said, so I went to the Veterans Administration and I said, can you please help me? I know that you help veterans. I served for my country. I fought. Can you please help me? And they said, no. He said, I went back home. He said, my wife is gone. My house is gone. And I'm sitting in the middle of this mess with water coming in. And I'm thinking, God, is life even worth it? Why should I even live? I have nothing left in the world. On this side of the road, you've got UMCOR coming in from the Methodist church. And as they ride by George's house, and I got to meet the first team that went down to meet George, as they ride by the house, one of the team members says, yeah, that's going to be the one we're stuck with. They need to condemn that one. And they go on to their lodging. Well, the next morning they get up and they're taken to the house that they're supposed to work on, and it's George's house. And they go in and they start cutting the tree out and doing stuff and working with the roof and stuff. And I said, well, George, what were you thinking? He said, I thought, what are these people doing? I have no money to pay them. Why are they down here helping me? Who am I that they would come down? He said, I have nothing, absolutely nothing. He said, my wife is gone. The storm has taken my home. He said, there's nothing left in my life. He said, but he said, those people came every day. He said, and they made me laugh. He said, and they included me in prayer. And when it was time to eat lunch, they made sure I had a sandwich too. They made sure I had something to drink too. They made sure that I was taken care of. When it came time to pray, they invited me in. When it came to time to go to dinner, they said, George, why don't you go with us? He said, and they worked and worked and worked. He said, my house is back whole again. I have a place to live. He said, if it weren't for the United Methodists coming in, he said, I would have taken my life. He said, through those storms, I had given up. And God sent me these people to be there and help me. He said, so now that my home is fixed, I find out where UMCOR is going to be. And when I find out where they're going to be, I go to that house and I help them work. He said, the funny thing is, he said, there's still a sandwich for George. There's still water for George. And I'm telling you, those women would not let us leave that building. They said, do you have George's lunch? Every morning before we left, they made sure that we had George's lunch before we went out the door. George had went through some horrible storms. And God was able to reach down and pull him back up. I had the blessing of meeting with a lovely couple last night, and they're very good friends of mine. And we were eating dinner, and this couple is in their early 30s, and they have committed to each other and to God that they're going to read through the Bible this year together. This is a couple's activity. They're going to do this, and every day they come together and they have their list and they read the Bible together and they talk about it. So we were talking last night, and he said, guess what we read last night, or like this last week? I said, well, I don't know. What did you read? He said, we read the book of Job. And this family has been going through so much. And I said, well, how did that make you feel? And he said, well, I went back and read it again. I said, okay. How did that make you feel? Sometimes my psychology comes out. And he said, we're living Job. He said, all the stuff that we're going through, we're living Job. And he was so excited about it. And I said, wow. I said, that is really neat. I said, so what do you think? He said, I've read the end of it twice now. He said, God blesses Job. Job is faithful to God, and God blesses Job. Job gets back everything that he lost plus some. He said, God is going to bless us if we're faithful to him. He said, and we're going to be faithful because we know that no matter how bad the storm is, God's got this, and we're okay. He said, but I just thought it was funny that we were living Job. And I said, what a wonderful way to look at it. With all this family has gone through, and to be able to say, we're living Job. We're living through this. We know how the story ends, how exciting it is. God is going to bless us if we stay faithful. I can't imagine how tired Jesus was, and to finally want to get away. And I'll tell y'all, your preacher gets tired sometimes too. And if I ever say to y'all, I'm going to St. Francis Springs for a couple of days, you may as well not call me because my phone doesn't work up there. You may as well not email me because email doesn't work up there. There is an emergency number, but that is my place to go to get away because I know that nobody can get me and I can have time with just God. But after this time, he goes to his disciples. He walks on the water and he goes out to meet them. James Moore did a book several years ago, and I don't know how many of y'all have read James Moore, but he wrote the book, Some Folks Feel the Rain, Others Get Wet. I love that title. Some folks feel the rain. To me, that's the kids that go out and jump in mud puddles. Now, I'm asking the grown-ups this question. How many grown-ups have played in mud puddles? I can imagine you would. Good, good. Well, the next question is, how many of us tell kids, y'all don't need to play in that mud puddle? I love the mud puddles. I love the puddles. They feel the rain. They get out. They play in it. It's exciting. It's fun. They don't just get wet, but they feel the excitement. Can you imagine if every time it rained and we had a storm, we thought about God's love just encasing us? God's presence being with us. That drop of rain isn't rain. That's a kiss from God. The wind is his gentle voice speaking to us. How wonderful that would be if we looked at storms differently. If we actually ran to the rain. If we ran to the storm. James tells us that in our troubles, we become stronger, right? But to become stronger, we have to have faith in God. We have to have faith in God. Storms reminds us that God is always near, that he never leaves us. Even when things are bad, we know that God is always there. Do you run to God? Do you ask him to hold your hand and let you get out of the boat? And if we do get out of the boat, do we start sinking? Do you feel the rain? Or do you just get wet? You know, sometimes there are days that I just get wet. But there are days that I feel the rain. And I love to feel the rain. Because I know that it's God's presence and God's love. God is in this place. His presence fills it. He says, you know, we may have a small congregation for now, but y'all share this love with everybody. Y'all share this presence with people. We're getting ready to have the back to school bash and have kids here that we can spread love to, that we can share God's joy with. What a blessing that is. You can't come and do all the work. I told Jane the other day, she was talking about trying to get back to church. She said, I want to be back at least by the yard sale. I said, well, woman, we'll put you back to work. And she said, well, I don't know what I can do. I said, can you sit there and take money? She said, yes. I said, can you sit there and pray for people? She said, yes. I said, then you got a job. You know, some of us think being with kids is a little much. We're too old for it. But you can smile at a kid. You can pray for a kid. You can let a kid know that they're important. And those words may make a difference in that child's life. The kids that are coming, we don't know how many of those have storms in their lives. We don't know how many of those have lifelines in those storms. But God gives us the grace and the mercy. And he says, I'm going to send you these kids. It's up to you to let them know my peace and grace. Amen.